Happy Sabbath. Happy July 4th, everybody. Glad you're here. So welcome. Welcome to those online who are watching as well. So not only is it the celebration of 250 years for the birth of the nation, but it's also the first quarter, or the first lesson of an entirely new quarter. So we wrapped up last week, and now we're going into Corinthians. So I hope everyone got a new quarter for this period. If you didn't, they are out in the foyer, or if those of you who are online or those who like to use devices, if you go to ABSG and then it's and you just search for Adult Bible Study Guide, it's all online, so you can get either PDF or web version, but it's pretty nice. That way you don't have to remember to bring your quarterly with you. All right, so it starts off, and we're going to be reading through the lesson here, but it starts off talking about Paul's ministry, right? So just to set the scene here, this is, I'm just going to be redundant here and obvious, but not everybody knows this, but Paul came along after Jesus had left, right? So Jesus was here on the earth. He was risen again, ascended to heaven, and then all the disciples were left on earth, and they said, well, what are we supposed to do now? And Paul came on just shortly after that with his conversion. And so Paul has been out teaching and preaching and trying to share the gospel, and now we're going to catch up with him as he continues his ministry. And so these are just stories, written down accounts of what Paul was going through, and then I think what we're trying to do here is the lesson's probably trying to ask us to look at what Paul was up to and say, are there any things that we can take from this and apply to our lives now, right? World's a very different place than back in this time, but I hope you'll see there's some common features. So our memory text, I'm just going to start in Sabbath's lesson here on the first page. The memory text comes from Acts 9:18, verses 9 and 10. So I'm just going to go over to my Bible and read that for you guys here. And the Lord said to Paul in one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people." So we have a lot of freedom in this country. Has anyone ever felt afraid that they were going to be attacked if they said something? Yes? Yes, regularly. Physically attacked or verbally attacked? Physically attacked. Physically attacked. Okay, so this is not a new concept, right? Like the words that come out of our mouth could incite harm against us. Yes. And I'm guessing there's certain things that you could say that would really incite harm against you, and that's probably when you push major buttons such as what Paul was talking about, which is salvation, eternal life, the structure of the world. Is there a God? Is there not a God? How should we worship that God? Those are things that people really, really care about and tend to be passionate about. Has God ever come to any of you and said, say whatever you want for the next 6 months, I have your back, no one's going to attack you? No, yeah, I personally have not had that. I mean, that would be pretty cool. Maybe I'm not out there saying the things Paul said, though, so maybe that's why God hasn't said that to me. But yeah, so I think reading between the lines, Paul must have really been saying things that were quite inflammatory if God had to reassure him that no one will attack you to harm you. Up to this point, who was Paul talking to in this area? Why would God say, don't worry about it, I have a lot of people in this city? Do we know who he was ministering to initially? So I think Acts tells us this answer. So if we go back, so it's kind of nice to kind of just start in the beginning. So if we start in chapter 18, you can see how this happened, right? So Paul left Athens, and he went to Corinth, so a couple cities in Greece. And who did he stay with? Well, he stayed with a Jew, Aquila, a native of Pontus, and they had recently come into town from Italy. So that's interesting. So kind of two transplants coming into the same area. And did Paul just kind of, I think this is very interesting, did Paul just kind of mooch and say, well, I'm an important speaker, I'm spreading God's word, I'm just going to hang out with you and you're going to help take care of me? He was working, exactly. What was he doing?
He was a tent maker.
Yeah, exactly. So that's interesting, right? So Paul was carrying his own way and doing all these things on the side, but you can see what he was up to and the people that he was witnessing to. In verse 4, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. But these would be the people who were worshiping in the synagogue, so those who at least were open to the idea of the Jewish faith, the idea of God as portrayed by the Jewish faith, up until that point. And then I think it's interesting that God had to come to him and say, you can go out into the rest of the city. It's okay. You're not going to be attacked. I have a lot of people who want to hear what you have to say in the city. So do you ever feel like, let's just say Sioux Falls or South Dakota, do you ever feel like the people around this area do or do not want to hear what we have to say? Do you think they're interested? How do you feel? I mean, I guess I appreciate God telling Paul that I have many people in the city that want to hear what you have to say, because I do think we get the impression quite often that people are not interested, right? Like they're just, the fact that they don't come here to worship with us on Sabbath, well, then maybe they don't want to know about it. But on the other hand, the barrier to get out and go somewhere new, like let's say back in Corinth, the barrier for someone in Corinth, which was a major trading town, to go to the synagogue on Sabbath and worship with the Jews is probably pretty high, right? Like I don't think the average person would go adventure into that arena. And so I think God is telling him, you need to go out to where the people are, and they do want to hear what you have to say. So that's kind of interesting. So, all right, let's move on. If you guys don't have anything else on that one, let's move on to Sunday. And so Corinthians, the book of Corinthians, which we are studying 1st and 2nd Corinthians this quarter, is like many of the other New Testament chapters where it's actually a letter, right? So this originally was a letter that Paul wrote, and it was preserved and incorporated into the canon of the Bible. So these are the books that God chose to say, hey, I really, really think you should have this information. You need to learn from this, and that's why it's in there. But it initially was a letter, right? It was meant as a letter from Paul to the church. So what did Paul think of himself, or maybe that's not the correct word. What did Paul consider his primary label? Was he a tent maker?
No, he was an apostle.
Yeah, exactly. That's like in 1 Corinthians, he says, I am an apostle of Christ Jesus, and not by his will, but by the will of God. And I think that if you think back to Paul's conversion experience where he was, hit on the road and lost his sight for a few days, I don't think he had anything to do with that decision. That was God calling him. So he knows that. Okay, and then he's writing to the church of God in verse 2 in Corinth, called to be saints together with all who in every place call upon the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, both their Lord and ours. Interesting that he keeps saying Jesus, Jesus, Jesus over and over again, and I think it's because he's trying to draw a distinction to say, you guys are not Jews anymore. We believe in Jesus as the Messiah. Like that's the important, that we're drawing a line, and if you're part of this church, you do believe Jesus is the Messiah or the Christ. Okay, so question here. What was Paul up to or what was his concerns in Corinth? So we can kind of start reading through the chapter a little bit, but I think usually when you write a letter, let me back up a little bit. Usually when you write a letter, it's either to say, hey, haven't heard from you for a while, how are you doing? But quite often when Paul writes a letter, it's to say, I've heard some things, I've noticed some things, I have some concerns, or to reinforce the message of when he was there. And so that I think as we go through this chapter, hopefully we can see some of the ideas that Paul is concerned about. Okay, let's see. So clearly Paul had a unique experience like we talked about, right? He was called. He was doing his Pharisee law-giving activities. He was very, very much in that role, and then he had a major conversion experience, was then called to now witness for Jesus and spread the gospel. And the question here is, many of us probably don't have that dramatic of an experience, right? To say we are called to do something. Do you see down here where it says, how do you know what is your calling? People spend their entire lives trying to figure out who am I and what am I supposed to do with my life. Have you ever wondered what is your calling if you didn't have a clear-cut experience like Paul? Do we all have a calling? It's a good question, right? Because maybe you could say, well, I'm going to be the best parent I can be. Maybe my calling is to, whatever your occupation is, I'm going to do the best that I can do of this occupation. I think Paul is trying to share with us, especially through many of these letters, though, that we do have another calling. And Jesus called us to do this as well, which is to spread the gospel, right? And when you don't have a distinct conversion experience like Paul, maybe it's a little bit harder to kind of see that, but that is a calling that we all have as well as Christians. All right, so let's move on here go to Monday's lesson. From Athens to Corinth, right? So Paul kind of jumped around from place to place. He didn't just set up shop for 10 to 15 years and write out the rest of his ministry in one location. His style, or what you could even say what his calling was, what God was asking him to do, was to go to different areas, spread the word for a little while, hand it off to the local people, and head out and go somewhere else. Kind of a unique life, right? I mean, I think we get used to where we live. We like to make those long-term relationships, friendships. I like to know which route I'm driving to work. I don't want to have to learn a new route every single day, right? Like you get in those routines. And Paul seems very comfortable mixing it up and going different places all the time. I think it takes a unique person to do that. I don't know if I would be able to do that. So let's go to Acts chapter 17. So they want us to know what was Paul up to before he came into Corinth. So we'll investigate that a little bit. All right, and then we're going to go down to verse 16 here. So Acts chapter 17, verse 16, right? So Paul was in Athens, and it says his spirit was provoked within him. I think nowadays we would probably say he was angry. He didn't like it. He got mad. And why was he mad? Well, the city was full of idols, right? And in that day, I think the idols were fairly transparent, right? You could walk around town and you could see temple to this, temple to that. You could see stone carving of this thing that people were worshiping. If Paul came to Sioux Falls, would he say, your city is full of idols? I don't think we have the classic idols that are described, but I would submit to you maybe we have different idols. So, if you go and you see people outside and they're, some people, their car is their idol, right? Other people, it's something else that they have, or it's they spend every waking moment, following their sports team and going to the games. And I think we all could say there are some idols or things that we spend our attention to, but I don't think the average person around here worships a piece of stone or a piece of wood that they've carved into a different deity, right? That's pretty rare around this area. Okay, so he saw that the city was full of idols, and what did he do? Well, in verse 17, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. So, what does that mean to you when it says he reasoned with them? Does that mean he told them the way it was and what was correct?
I think it's probably more of a conversation back and forth,
Yeah.
trying to understand what their thought process or rationale was.
I mean, I'm a believer in Jesus, but I gotta tell you, when I go downtown and I hear somebody yelling at me from the street corner, I'm not too inclined to have a conversation with them, right? So, yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. I think it happened. I think he was very much in the role of, let's discuss. You have your beliefs, I have my beliefs. Can I find any ways that I can persuade you that there is a God? And so if we read on here, that's exactly what he was doing. So these were philosophers, right? So Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, this was kind of the holdover from Greece. They had many different beliefs, right? So all throughout history, humans look at the world, they see bad things happen, they see good things happen, and they try to come up with explanations as to why those things happen, right? And any time that doesn't involve God, you're going to come up with all kinds of different beliefs, and that's just all this is they had had a way of explaining the world and how the world worked. And what do they say? They say, "What does this babbler wish to say? He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And that's a pretty, if you want to say what's a fairly inflammatory statement to pretty much anyone who's been alive on earth and been alive for any bit of time, the idea to say that this person was dead and now they're alive again, we just don't see that, right? Like that is not part of human experience. So if you walk into a random town and you say, hey, there's this guy, he lived over in Israel and he was crucified by the Romans, and guess what? He's alive, and he's actually not even alive. He's even more than alive. He actually is up in heaven right now. I mean, that you can see why they would call him a babbler, right? That would be a pretty foreign concept to them. But that's what Paul was telling him. He was essentially teaching the gospel, teaching the resurrection. And so they brought him to the Areopagus. Do you guys know what that was? It's kind of like essentially the town hall, town square. It's a place where you kind of debate, have more formal debates. And so just an area, I guess, I don't know what that equivalent would be. I think over in England they have, kind of the Oxford debates, which are these structured debates. Maybe in the US that would not really be a presidential debate, but maybe some of our talk shows that we have on TV where you bring the different experts together and they debate with each other. Maybe that'd be that equivalent. But anyway, they brought him there and they asked him a question, and they wanted to know, what is this new teaching that you're presenting, right? Like, how in the world can you have somebody who is dead and then rises again? Because this is strange. We want to know what it means. And they wanted to know. And actually, that's a really interesting concept of people who are open to hearing new information. So I think that's kind of the starting point, in my opinion. If you have someone who is very strong in what they know, and they're not interested in hearing anything new, anything you tell them is just going to be uncomfortable and they're not going to listen, do you think you're going to be able to have a conversation with them? Yeah, probably not. But the Athenians seem to like to know. It says in verse 21, they wanted to, they spent all their time telling or hearing something new. They wanted new information. They wanted to learn. They wanted to learn. And so they said, what is this new thing that you're talking about? And so that's kind of was Paul's opening to them to kind of talk about, here's what I've seen, here's what I believe, Here's what I think we should do. So he goes on and he addresses them. And I think this is kind of an interesting, I do go back to this when I think about how do we talk to those who are not Christian, not believers, right? I think it's relatively easy to talk to others who already believe in the Bible, they already believe in God, they already believe in Jesus, and to say, oh, well, here's some more information that we have as Adventists. But to start from the point of someone who does not believe in God at all, that's pretty tricky. And so that's kind of what Paul does here in this section of verse 22 all the way down, is he starts with, he's observed their local culture, right? So you go to somebody's home or you see where they live and you notice things that they care about, things that they believe in, and he uses that as a starting point with them for the conversation, right? So he says, I see that you are very religious, right? Doesn't mean that they worship God, but it means that they do worship something. And he found an altar to the unknown God. So it said to the unknown God. So the Athenians clearly realized that maybe there were gods that they didn't even know about that they would worship. And so then Paul uses that as a starting point to say, actually this unknown God is the God, and he doesn't live in your little temples that you've made. It's kind of crazy that humans would sit there and say there's this all-powerful God that could affect the weather, do all these, even create the earth, all these things, and yet I can make a little carving of them out of my hands, my little monkey hands, and worship that, right? Like, it's a little bit interesting. So, but yeah, he's basically saying that, the Lord of heaven and earth, down in verse 24, does not live in temples made by man, and is not served by human hands. And so that, it goes on and it kind of goes through the whole, he's just essentially presenting what he believes based on the gospel, and the resurrection of Jesus and the chance for everlasting life with belief in Jesus. And, you can see that what was the response, right? So if you go out there, I think to take this conversation full circle from where we started, where we said, if you tell people things that they don't want to hear, are they always going to be nice to you? Are they going to be mean to you? Are they going to attack you? I think the answer is yes, right? So if you see down in verse 32, what happened to Paul? So when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, right? They didn't attack him, they didn't physically hurt him, but I'm guessing their words were not very nice, right? Yeah. And, but others, so here's the important point, right? So when we go out there and we talk to others, will we be rejected? 100%. Some of the people just will have nothing to do with what you want to say, right? They are not interested. Others, though, and these are the ones that I think are reachable, others said, we will hear you again about this. So also, I think, I don't know how you guys thought. I grew up in the church, so, we would do sometimes like, Bible studies or things like that. And for some reason, you get this impression that if you just said the right thing, people would have an amazing conversion experience and instantly, like the thief on the cross, would be like, oh yes, thank you for sharing, and now I believe, and can I get baptized next weekend? But it doesn't usually work like that, right? So usually it's a process, and I think what you usually will hear is, we will hear you again about this, right? There is some interest, there is some openness to hearing about what you have to say, and they're willing to talk to you again, right? But I think if we go into it expecting that we're just going to say the right thing, the perfect thing, and someone else is going to instantly be a believer, and I think it can work like that. Absolutely, there's examples in the Bible of it working like that, but I don't know if that's the most typical process. Okay, so Paul's doing all this. That's why he left Athens, because he had finished his talking about Jesus to the Athenians, and so like Paul usually does, he's got to go on to the next stop, right? So he goes on to Corinth, and we had already kind of read what Acts in chapter 18, what Paul was up to And so he had started with the Jews, and then, like we had read, he was then asked to go and talk to the rest of the people in Corinth. So down in the questions at the bottom of the lesson on that day, we kind of hit many of these, like how do we share the gospel of success, what strategies. So I feel like we've kind of hit these points. Is there anything else that you guys have noticed that works or doesn't work, or you know, if you're trying to share with those that you know might be not necessarily super excited about the gospel or what you have to say? Any things that you've used that are helpful tools or tricks? I think everyone will admit it's an uncomfortable situation. It's a difficult problem, and even Paul, if you wanted to say, like, I hate to rank people as far as like who's the best, but Paul really was good at what he did, right? He brought a lot of people to Christ, and even he obviously was afraid, and God had to reassure him that I'm there with you, right? Okay, so down in, let's make sure we get some of this still covered, because this is setting the stage for the rest of the quarter. I think the lesson wants us to learn a little more about what Corinth was like, right? So just like we're in Sioux Falls right now, and your experience might be very different than someone who's living in LA or New York City or rural Georgia or southern Florida. You have to know what your environment is like, right? Who are the people that are around you? What are they up to? And so that's important for Corinth as well. So Corinth, I think, looking at, and I kind of looked this up a little bit before the lesson here, I would say Corinth is probably the equivalent of some of our shipping-heavy, commerce-heavy towns. Like you could probably think maybe similar to even LA, because it's a port city. A lot of the shipments that come into the rest of the country might come through that area, a lot of trade. You could think about like maybe Boston as well before maybe 50, 75 years ago when there was a lot of shipments into Boston. So that's kind of where it was. And if you look at where in the Mediterranean, Greece and Italy are kind of right in the middle there, right? So that's where all the action is, right? So they get a lot of mixing of people coming in, people coming out, trade coming through that area. When you have trade, all the middlemen take their cut. So those towns tend to be fairly prosperous. And Paul, it says, okay, this is interesting. Paul, in the second paragraph, it says, Paul chose Corinth because of its importance and advantaged geographic location. I'm not 100% sure that Paul chose. Yeah, I think that's God. If Paul was, so anyway, I take issue with that. I think that Paul was willing to go where God told him to go, but I don't know if we'll find out, I guess. We can ask Paul one day, but I suspect that was God directing him to go to Corinth. And there's a correlation here between Corinth and ancient Israel. So you guys kind of know your geography in the Middle East. And if you look at where Israel is, at least at the time that it was there, it was at the crossroads of many nations. So many people would kind of come and go through that area or go around that area, and that was a way for God to show and reach many, many people. Corinth, the center of the world, kind of shifted a little bit during this time. So Corinth now would be considered somewhat the center of these activities, and so that's perfect because now he's situated in an area where you can reach many more people. And you're starting out a time from, so now we're 2026, so we're over 2,000 years from one person being on earth, talking to 12 people, and then those people going out and spreading this message all throughout the world. This is how it exploded so quickly, even within a few hundred years. Really rapid advance of spreading the gospel, and that's partly through parking themselves in areas where there would be a lot of talking and mission work. But what was the problem with Corinth? Was it already such a good, was it a religious town? Was it a town of great morals? Not exactly. People had a lot of distractions. Wherever there's disposable money, which they did have in Corinth, there were a lot of distractions. So they had shrines to all these different gods that the Greeks believed in. They were very, I guess, open, and they even would worship Egyptian gods as well. I didn't know that. That's very interesting. And, just some sexual immorality. We have this in the United States as well, right? Any country where you have a lot of disposable money, you have people involved in the trades, there's a lot of downtime kind of when the products are being brought into the port and you're waiting to go out to the next shipment or the next trip, people are going to get up to no good. And that was a situation that was happening in Corinth as well. And so Paul faced those challenges. And so it says, what challenges in today's culture can make it hard to preach the gospel? Is there any difference between Corinth and our cities today? Not a lot. Yeah. I mean, you could say we don't have the exact same problems. I don't think there's a temple to Apollo or whatever, but I think we have plenty of sexual immorality, right? We have plenty of things that distract us that if Paul's going to talk to somebody and say, you need Jesus in your life, they say, I'm feeling pretty good. I got a lot of things. Life's pretty good. It's hard to reach people when they have much. When you have nothing, then they need God, right? Yeah. So that's kind of what we were going to be learning about here. And then this is kind of going down to say when Paul started preaching. This is Acts 18:4-8. What happened? And so, did they like it? I shouldn't say they. How about his home team? How about the people that he came from? Were they happy with what he was having to say? Yeah, not so much. So these were the Jews. So it's kind of like you're threatening the brand, right? So the Jews say, well, we have our God. We have our rules. This is how we do things. And you're now teaching something different. We don't like what you have to say. So Paul basically said, I'm done with you guys, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to worship and witness to the rest of the people in the city. So the reaction of the Jews to Paul was not favorable. There is a saying that Jesus said, which I totally agree with, is a prophet has no honor in their own house. So sometimes if you're already in a place and they know you, they're not as open to listening to what you have to say. And that can be discouraging. So here's another interesting thing I thought on Wednesday's lesson. Quite often we do not actually, the Bible usually just tells us what happened, right? It says this happened and this happened. It's not often that we actually get into the head of someone who is working, right, in the Bible. Like Jesus, you can see that he was very worried and concerned and stressed. You could use all those words, anguished the night before crucifixion. Sometimes we get those little hints of emotion that come out. But quite often it just says, well, they were here, then they went on to this spot, this is what they said, this is what they did, right? But in verse 9 and 10, you can see that we get a little bit of an insight into the head of Paul, that even though he went and did all these amazing things, right? He would go to a new place, he would boldly preach the gospel, he was afraid, right? And so I think that to me is quite reassuring, that when we sit there and say, well, that was Paul, he's amazing, there's no way I could do that. I can't do what Paul did. I can't do what Jesus did. Yeah, you're right. You can't do it, but I think God working through you can. And, but yeah, it still has the human emotion there where he very much was afraid of what was going to happen if he went out there and talked to the rest of the people, knowing that the vast majority of the city was not interested in what he was up to. They were interested in idols, the trade, profit-making, etc. All right, so we just got a couple minutes left, so we can wrap it up here with Thursday's lesson. So this is kind of getting now into Corinthians. So we were in Acts, we were describing why he was in Athens, why he went to Corinth, what was the reaction of him when he was in Corinth, and then now he's writing this letter back to the Corinthians. And so we're just going to maybe hit a couple of these if we have time here. So 1 Corinthians 1, 11 through 13. Okay, so it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there is quarreling among you, my brothers. Oh my goodness. Well, this never happened in the church. We all just get along, don't we? Everyone gets along. Everybody says, I am 100% in line with you. What you want to do is what I want to do. We have the same vision of how everything should run inside the church. Yeah, no, it sounds like nothing's changed for 2,000 years, right? So I think that's, to me, it's sad, but it's also reassuring that we're not any different, right? That these issues are going to be there. At this time, the issue was over baptism, who you baptize in the name of. That's their issue. We have our other issues. You could probably in your head go down the list of issues that have come up throughout your entire life of things that people fought over inside the church that were, in hindsight, probably pretty trivial. But yeah, it's nothing new. And I think that what does Paul say down in verse 17? And I think this is a good reminder that if we just kind of focus on the core features, we can try to, we can work out these differences. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. But what does Paul say? He says, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied in its power. So basically it's just saying, hey, guys, just stop. Just, let's focus on the gospel, and let's focus on Jesus Christ and the sacrifice that he made. Cut out all the quarreling. So I think it's just a good reminder that these issues are still with us here today, but as long as we focus on the gospel, focus on what Jesus did for us, I think we as a community of believers will be just fine. All right. Last couple minutes here. Anyone else have anything that they want to add from the lesson this week? I know this was kind of just like a introduction lesson, so just getting our feet wet, but okay, well, yeah, I think this should be a good one. I enjoy reading Paul. He's definitely, if anything, a little bit spicy. So it's not a boring read. So it should be a good quarter. Appreciate you guys being here this morning, and again, wish you to have a happy 4th. If you won't mind, close your eyes with me. We're going to pray. Father, thank you for this nation. Thank you for the sacrifice of those who have come before us to help give us the freedom to assemble here together, Lord, to say things that not everyone would agree with, to have open conversation, discussion, to have the ability to disagree with each other and yet not lead to oppression or violence. And we ask you, Lord, that you be with us throughout the rest of the service. We thank you for the sacrifice that you made for us, that we may have everlasting life, and guide us in the coming week. In your name, amen.